Carl Jung, life begins when you find yourself. The journey back to you, is this life really mine? You've done what's expected, followed the path, worn the mask. But deep down, something feels off, as if you've been acting in a script written by someone else's parents, society, fear. Carl Jung believed that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will control our lives, and we will call it fate. This video is not about motivation. It's not about becoming a better version. It's about waking up. We'll dive deep into the parts of you that have been suppressed, the shadow you hide, the roles you cling to, the ego you mistake for yourself. And maybe something inside you is ready to remember who you were before the world told you who to be. Stay until the end. The journey back to your real self may not be easy, but it's the only one that leads to freedom. When you realize your life is a script written by others, there comes a moment that all of us will eventually face one morning. Amidst the daily cycles, you pause and ask yourself, is this life truly mine? The decisions you once believed were free, the desires you thought came from the heart, were they truly yours, or merely echoes of expectations you never consciously chose? Carl Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This isn't just a psychological theory, it's a mirror reflecting the reality of so many people, those who live as though they've chosen everything, while in truth, they're just following a pre-written script, one programmed by family, society, school, collective beliefs, and the fear of rejection. Have you ever felt like you were playing a role? The good child, the competent employee, the ideal partner. Each role brings safety, recognition, but also takes away fragments of your true self. You grow used to smiling when you're not happy, nodding while your soul resists, compromising when your spirit longs to break free. But eventually, no matter how successful you are or how much validation you receive, there will be a void, a quiet unrest in the soul, a sense that you're living someone else's life. That's not instability. It's the first signal of awakening, the whisper of your real self trying to find its way back. What suffocates us in life isn't a lack of effort, but the fact that we don't know who we're living for. The moment you ask, who am I without all these roles? You've taken your first step toward the journey of returning to yourself, a journey Jung called individuation, the process of becoming a whole, authentic individual. That's when real life truly begins. Why most people never truly find themselves. Finding yourself is not a simple action. It's not like choosing a new path or changing your goals. It's a deep encounter with everything you've spent years avoiding: fear, wounds, expectations, and the painful truth that much of your life has been led by a self that doesn't truly belong to you. Why do most people never truly find themselves? Because from the moment we enter life, we are buried under layers of conditioning. Our families give us a name along with a series of roles: the good child, the smart student, the kind person, the model citizen. Society then creates standards of what it means to be normal, successful, or worthy. Every time we try to live up to those standards, a part of us is pushed deeper into the unconscious. We learn to live for acceptance, not for authenticity. Carl Jung called this phenomenon the dependency on the persona, the social mask we wear to adapt to the world. But the problem is, when we wear it for too long, we forget the difference between the mask and the true face beneath. We're not taught how to sit with sadness. We're not allowed to be angry. We're discouraged from appearing weak. We're told not to dream too much, not to question, not to step outside the lines. Instead, we learn to avoid emotion, hide sensitivity, extinguish unrealistic dreams, and pretend that everything is fine. All of that eventually creates a standardized version of you, a person built to fit in, to stay safe, to avoid rejection. But deep down, there's still a voice, faint but persistent, that keeps asking, is this really me? And because the path to the self demands tearing off those layers of mask, enduring the loneliness of not fitting in, and confronting your imperfections, most people stop halfway. They return to safety, continuing to live as if that version is truly them, even though they know deep inside it's just a shell. Finding yourself isn't hard because it's far. It's hard because it's so close you fail to notice. It's always been there in your dreams, your silent pain, your quiet urge that whispers, "It's time to live honestly." But not everyone dares to answer that call. The social mask and the darkness you hide every day to survive in this world. Each of us is forced to learn how to wear a mask. Jung called it the persona, the face we show the world, molded to fit in, to be loved, to avoid rejection. You smile while carrying anger inside. You say, "I'm fine with a broken heart." You act strong, successful, and stable, so no one sees the softness within. And slowly, you forget that's not you. That's a role, a character you created to survive in a world ruled by strict expectations of society, your family, and even yourself. But opposite to the persona lies another part, the part you don't want anyone to see. Jung called it the shadow, your psychological darkness. It's where you store everything deemed unacceptable: anger, jealousy, weakness, buried dreams, even the sensitivity you had as a child that was rejected. You don't eliminate those parts. You suppress them. But the darkness doesn't vanish, it waits. It surfaces through other forms. You may resent someone simply because they dare do what you can't. You may criticize others for expressing the very emotions you've been denying. That's projection when you throw your rejected parts onto someone else. The real question is, if you fear others seeing your ugly parts, have you ever dared to see them for yourself? Not to shame or punish, but to understand and integrate. Jung never asked us to destroy the shadow. On the contrary, he believed it holds your denied power, buried potential, and the most authentic parts of you lost in the process of growing up. Integrating the shadow doesn't make you perfect. It means admitting you're not, and that doesn't make you less worthy. That's the first step of healing when you stop running from who you are. The world out there keeps telling you who to become, but the shadow quietly reminds you, before you become someone, learn how to be yourself. Whole, messy, unfinished, and worthy of love. Becoming no one, just returning to yourself. We grow up believing that life is about becoming someone, a successful person, a talented one, an admirable figure that society or our parents once expected of us. So we keep running, climbing, striving, convinced that once we achieve it, we'll be happy, complete. But Carl Jung offered a different view. He didn't talk about becoming someone, but about returning to who you are. This is the process of individuation, becoming a whole, authentic being where every piece, both light and dark, accepted and rejected, is acknowledged and integrated into one. Individuation isn't an upward climb. It's a descent, not a chase for external brilliance, but a shining inward light. Not about adding more, but removing what isn't truly you. That's why this journey is so difficult. To return to yourself, you must walk away from what once made you feel safe, identities, roles, validation. You must lay down the mask you've worn for years. You must dare to face the parts you've rejected: insecurity, sadness, jealousy, unhealed wounds. Only then will you truly be free. You no longer need to pretend. You no longer need to seek approval. You can slow down, breathe deeply, live honestly, and realize only when you are yourself can you truly connect with others and with life. Jung once said, "Man doesn't grow by staying in the light, but by descending into the darkness and embracing his shadow." And through that process, you don't lose yourself, you are reborn. No longer fragmented, no longer hiding, no longer divided. And one day, as you look back, you'll realize you're no longer striving to become, because you've learned to fully be with yourself here and now. The invisible wounds of childhood that were never named, most of our deepest emotional wounds, don't come from major traumas, but from small, quiet moments repeated endlessly throughout our childhood. They leave no marks on the skin, but they carve deep imprints into the unconscious, shaping how we love, how we fear, how we choose, and how we limit ourselves as adults. Do you remember the first time you were mocked for expressing emotion? Maybe it was a casual comment: "Don't be such a crybaby. Boys don't cry. Why are you so sensitive?" But for a child, those were the first messages that said, "Your emotions are not welcome." Or the time you excitedly shared a dream only to receive skeptical looks or a "be realistic" lecture. In that moment, a seed was buried. Dreams aren't allowed to exist if they don't make sense. Bit by bit, we learned to suppress what was most natural in us. We stopped crying when we were sad, stopped showing anger when hurt, stopped saying what we truly felt. We adapted to be loved, to be accepted, to stay safe. But the cost was this: we lost connection with ourselves. Carl Jung didn't view childhood wounds as trivial stories of the past. On the contrary, he believed these early experiences are where the unconscious begins to take form. If not revisited and healed, they continue to shape us in many ways: fear of abandonment, feelings of inadequacy, people-pleasing tendencies, or a vague guilt every time we do something for ourselves. Have you ever wondered why you strive for perfection? Why you're afraid to say no? Why someone leaving makes you feel worthless? These didn't begin today. They are the accumulated responses to small cracks from the past, when you were a child seeking validation, but not heard in the way you needed. And here's the hardest part to accept: no one meant to hurt you. Your parents, teachers, the adults around you, they were once wounded children too. They simply passed on what they had learned, unknowingly transferring limiting beliefs like an invisible inheritance. Understanding this means you no longer need to blame anyone, but you also no longer need to carry those wounds as part of your identity. You can begin to name your feelings again, to embrace the child you once were, and to say, your emotions are beautiful. You are not wrong for being sensitive. You are not weak for needing love. Healing begins when we dare to return not to blame, but to understand. And from that understanding, we can grow freely for the first time as our whole selves. When you no longer fear fear, you begin to be free. Fear was never the enemy. What causes us suffering is not fear itself, but our reaction to it. We avoid it, suppress it, pretend it doesn't exist, then force a stiff smile to cover it all up. But when we spend our lives running from fear, the one thing we truly lose is ourselves. Carl Jung believed that fear is an essential part of psychological growth. It's not a sign of weakness, it's a signal that you're standing at the edge of deep transformation. Fear often shows up right before you're about to break down a long-held defense, right before you leave behind the familiar ego and approach your true self. But instead of listening, we turn away. We're taught to be strong, to get over it, to move on. We learn to drown ourselves in work, scroll endlessly on social media, laugh to hide our pain. And so fear doesn't disappear, it simply sinks deeper and begins to control us from within. Ask yourself, what are you most afraid of? Rejection, failure, not being enough? Or perhaps something deeper, the fear that if you live authentically, you will no longer be loved? These fears are not random. They are echoes of past experiences. They are shadows left from times when being your true self got you hurt. But here's what you need to know: fear doesn't harm you, running from it does. Jung once said, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. So freedom doesn't come from eliminating fear, but from facing it with full presence. Not with urgency or judgment, just staying, breathing with it, and asking, what are you trying to teach me? You may be surprised to find that behind every fear is a part of you calling for attention. An abandoned dream, a boundary waiting to be set, a wound that longs to be held. Fear, when understood, becomes the gateway to inner freedom. You don't need to be fearless to act. You only need to stop judging the feeling as wrong. Let fear be there, like a quiet companion, and you'll realize courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to keep going even when your heart is trembling. True freedom is when you no longer fear the fact that you're afraid. When you no longer force yourself to prove anything, no longer pretend to be fine, no longer run from your most tender parts. Freedom is daring to show up as you are in this world, with honesty and gentleness. And perhaps from that moment you'll see what you've been searching for all along wasn't to conquer yourself, but to come home to yourself, fully and unconditionally. The unconscious is not a stranger. It's the silent voice within you. There's a part of you that quietly observes everything that happens even when you're not aware of it. It doesn't shout, argue, or insert itself into your logical thoughts, but it's always present. It's the place where strange dreams come from, where vague intuitions arise, where random images surface during your most silent moments. Carl Jung called this the personal unconscious, and more broadly, the collective unconscious, a deep spiritual space that holds all your buried memories, suppressed feelings, unseen aspects of your being, and the sacred symbols shared by all of humanity. The unconscious is not an enemy to control. It is a quiet companion, always sending signals to guide you back to your true self. But sadly, modern society teaches us to dismiss anything that can't be measured. Dreams are considered nonsense. Intuition is labeled irrational. Emotions are dismissed as obstacles to productivity. And so we disconnect from the unconscious, which means we disconnect from our true depth. Have you ever had a dream that lingered with you all day? Ever sensed something was wrong even when everything seemed fine? Or heard a melody, read a line of poetry, and felt something stir that you couldn't explain? That's the self, your deepest inner being, speaking through the language of the unconscious. Jung believed that dreams, symbols, art, music are bridges between the conscious and the unconscious. When we write, draw, play music, or simply sit in silence and listen to ourselves, we are opening a door inward. And here's the miracle: you don't have to be perfect there. You only have to be present. Healing doesn't begin with logic. It begins when you stop judging the voice inside you and start listening with curiosity and tenderness. The unconscious will never scream, but it will whisper through recurring dream symbols, nameless emotions, and sudden urges to change without a clear reason. When you listen long enough, you'll realize the unconscious is not a stranger. It's not scary. It's the deepest part of you waiting to be understood. And just like a forgotten child, once embraced, it begins to trust again. The unconscious no longer has to break you through crisis or disorder, because now you're finally willing to return and dialogue with yourself. In this noisy world, the act of pausing to listen within isn't escapism, it's the bravest act you can do. It's the first step on the journey back, not to become someone else, but to become a friend to yourself. Ancient archetypes, still live in your mind every day. You may think your daily decisions are entirely your own. You believe your emotions, choices, and behaviors come solely from conscious personal will. But the truth is, there are invisible forces inside your mind, silently shaping your life, and you don't even realize it. Carl Jung called these archetypes primordial psychological patterns that exist in the depths of the collective unconscious. They are not fictional characters or abstract philosophical ideas. They are living patterns appearing in mythology, religion, and ancient literature, and today, they still operate within you. Think of the hero archetype, the desire to overcome adversity, to achieve greatness; the villain darkness, anger; the hunger for power and control; the mentor wisdom, guidance, illumination; the innocent child faith, beginnings, untouched wonder. They don't just exist in stories. They live in you and in everyone. Each time you stand up for something while others oppose, the hero is awakened. When you find yourself repeating painful relationship patterns, perhaps the victim and rescuer are replaying. When someone triggers you, you may be confronting your shadow manifested through an archetypal figure you've yet to integrate. Archetypes are echoes of thousands of years of the human soul. They're like built-in templates in the operating system of the psyche, not to be blindly followed, but to be recognized, understood, and transcended. That's why Jung didn't ask us to avoid archetypes, but to become conscious of them. Because when you live out an archetype unconsciously, you're being controlled. But when you observe it with awareness, you gain the freedom to play the role or to rewrite the script. For example, many live their lives within the good person archetype, always pleasing others, always blaming themselves if they disappoint someone. But sometimes, the good person is just a mask hiding a fear of abandonment. When you recognize this archetype, you can pause and ask, am I being kind out of love or out of fear? Jung believes psychological growth doesn't mean eliminating archetypes, but integrating them consciously. The hero must learn his limits. The innocent child must open his eyes to the world while keeping a pure heart. The shadow must be brought into the light not to destroy, but to understand and reconcile. When you see these patterns living within you, you begin to untangle yourself from the invisible threads of collective history. You are no longer a product of what has happened to humanity. You become the one who writes a new chapter with awareness and choice. And perhaps for the first time, you'll realize you are not just you. You are the living continuation of the human soul awakening in your own unique, vivid existence. The masculine and feminine energies within you are seeking balance. We are often taught that personality, emotion, and behavior are largely determined by biological gender. Men are rational and strong, women are emotional and soft. But Carl Jung saw something deeper, that every human being, regardless of gender, carries both masculine and feminine energies within. He called these two energies anima, the feminine energy, within men, and animus, the masculine energy, within women. This has nothing to do with gender or sexuality. It is a psychological symbol representing two opposing yet complementary forces: logic and intuition, action and feeling, structure and creativity. In a society that glorifies logic, control, and achievement, feminine energy is often dismissed or suppressed. A sensitive man is seen as weak. A decisive woman is labeled as too aggressive. And thus we become entangled in biases that fracture our inner world. A man who fears expressing vulnerability may become emotionally numb and disconnected from himself and others. A woman who cannot assert her voice may live in quiet resentment or emotional dependency. Jung believed this imbalance between anima and animus is a root cause of many inner crises. Now imagine a man who trusts his intuition, feels deeply, and understands himself without shame. His strength becomes whole, not just about doing, but also about feeling. Or a woman who uses logic, sets boundaries, and says no without guilt. She's not only soft, but also grounded. Wholeness doesn't come from becoming extreme in one role, but from harmonizing both energies within, letting both reason and emotion take their rightful place, with neither being suppressed. When you live fully with both anima and animus, you no longer need to act according to gender roles. You are simply yourself, complete and unfragmented. This is especially vital in relationships. Many tensions between genders do not stem from differences, but from inner imbalance. A man who hasn't integrated his anima struggles to truly empathize. A woman without a conscious animus may fall into cycles of frustration when met with an unstable partner. Jung encouraged each person to engage with the opposite energy within, not to become someone else, but to become whole. It can begin with small steps: listening to your intuition, recording your dreams, learning to act decisively, or allowing yourself to be vulnerable without shame. You don't need to be perfectly balanced, but every step toward inner integration is a step forward on the healing journey. Because in a world of extremes, a human being who balances both their inner masculine and feminine becomes a safe haven, not just for themselves, but for those around them. The self you identify with is not truly you. We grow up with a clear story of who we are, a name, a past, a job, a personality repeated so many times it feels like permanent truth. But Carl Jung, along with many philosophers, mystics, and depth psychologists, reached a different conclusion. You are not just the ego you believe yourself to be. What we call the self is often just a surface layer, a temporary alignment of memories, habits, behaviors, and social roles. It's constructed so we can function in this world. But when you begin to ask questions like, who am I without this job? Who am I if no one likes me? Who am I when I'm alone, with no roles to cling to? You begin to touch the edges of the ego. Jung called this layer the ego. It's not bad. It gives us orientation, a sense of me versus not me. But when we fully identify with the ego, we forget that there is something deeper, freer, and more expansive: the self. The self is not limited by social identity or fear of judgment. It doesn't care whether you succeed or fail, are accepted or not. The self is your whole being, both what you like and what you've rejected, both light and shadow, reason and intuition, individuality and unity with all of humanity. Awakening begins when you realize the ego is not the center of your being. It's just a tool like the car you drive. But you are not the car, you are the driver. And sometimes you are the one who can step out of the car, walk barefoot in the morning sun, and feel whole without needing any identity to define your worth. Have you ever felt exhausted from always having to be someone? To live up to expectations, maintain the image you've built, always be fine, strong, in control? That's the ego overfunctioning. That's the self calling you back home. There's nothing wrong with having an ego. The problem begins only when you believe that's all you are. So how do you disidentify from it? You don't need to abandon everything. You only need to start observing yourself gently, like an outsider. When you overreact, ask, where is this coming from? When you're trying too hard to be loved, ask, who in me is afraid of being abandoned? When you feel empty, ask, what part of me is longing to return? The truth is, you are not the stories you tell yourself. You are not the labels society gave you. You are not the perfect version you've been striving to become. You are the one who is listening to it all with present, compassionate awareness. When you realize this, you no longer need to become anyone. You just return and begin to live as your true self. Without pressure, without defense, without proving. That's when the self begins to speak. That's when real life unfolds, not as a performance, but as your most authentic journey. Everyone is hurting in a silent way. You don't see. Have you ever felt angry at someone for being cold with you? Frustrated by someone who's always controlling? Hurt by someone who seems distant or careless? We often react. We judge. We label. But rarely do we pause to ask what's behind their behavior. Carl Jung once said, "What we don't understand in others is often a reflection of what we haven't understood in ourselves." But it's not just reflection. Sometimes, the unhealed wounds in the other person are exactly what formed the armor we now see and misinterpret. The controlling person may have grown up in chaos where they had no choice. The emotionally cold person may have once been hurt by dependency. The angry person may have had their emotions stifled in silence. Each of us carries a story, most of which have never been told. We often judge others by their present behavior, forgetting that every action is a result of something underneath. And sometimes that something is just this: a child who was never hugged when they cried, never heard when they needed comfort. When we understand this, something strange happens. Our anger softens. The coldness in our heart begins to thaw. We don't have to forgive. We don't have to accept. But we can feel compassion without excusing anything. Because we understand that everyone is trying to survive in the only way they know, even when that way hurts others. In this understanding, we stop seeing ourselves as victims. We begin to see with gentler eyes. And perhaps, in that softness, an old wound from both sides begins to heal. The psychological misbeliefs that make you suffer, some forms of suffering don't come from your circumstances, but from false beliefs you carry unconsciously. They're not true, but because you believe them, they shape your emotions, behaviors, and how you treat yourself. For example, negative emotions are bad. I must always be cheerful and positive. But this forces you to suppress sadness, bury anger, and fake being okay while you're falling apart inside. Healing is not about always being happy. It's about being honestly sad when you need to be. Or, being weak is a failure. I must be strong, independent, and never rely on anyone. But the strongest person is the one who dares to face their own vulnerability. Not to collapse, but to rise more deeply, more truly. Or, going to therapy or reading psychology is for people with problems. But who among us doesn't carry wounds? Jung once said, "We are all patients. The only difference is who chooses to heal and who doesn't." These misbeliefs choke you day by day. No one else forces you to accept the outdated beliefs you never questioned. And once you begin to ask, is this belief really true? You've already placed your hand on the door to freedom. Healing is not about becoming someone. It's about returning to yourself throughout life. We keep trying to be stronger, more successful, more stable, more profound, as if a perfect version of ourselves awaits us at the finish line. But the more we chase it, the further we stray from ourselves. Carl Jung whispers a different truth. You don't need to become someone. You just need to come home. Healing is not about building more. It's about unraveling. Not about reinventing yourself, but remembering who you've always been. The child who once dared to dream. The one who loved without calculation. The heart that was once fragile and never ashamed of it. Coming home is not easy. It asks you to let go of the layers you mistook for your identity. It asks you to touch unhealed pain, to listen to the shadow you've buried for too long. But when you're brave enough to sit with yourself, with no goal, no expectation, something miraculous happens. You realize you were never lost. You had only forgotten. And perhaps from that moment on, you no longer need to prove anything. You simply live with yourself, whole, quiet, free. The journey of finding yourself isn't a straight road. It has no clear destination. It's a circular path where you don't reach outward to gain anything. but turn inward to remember who you've always been. And perhaps the most beautiful part is not who you become, but that you dared to live fully as the deepest, most fragile, most whole version of yourself, without fear, without hiding, because life truly begins the moment you find your way back to yourself.